Society classifies love as an emotion, yet human beings routinely feel intense love alongside anger, fear, grief, or joy. This scatterplot maps out hundreds of emotional data points recorded during moments people describe as love. As the data points form clusters and jagged lines, you can see the contradiction. The state we call love occurs simultaneously with entirely conflicting feelings. It is all over the emotional map. This pattern suggests love functions differently than a single emotion. It acts as a stable orientation that remains even as our internal feeling states shift. Relying on love as a fleeting feeling leads directly to relationship failure. When the feeling fades, the connection collapses. Resolving this requires a mechanical, physics-based understanding of human interaction. Clinical psychologist Dr. Michael D. Lukens spent over 30 years researching and developing this precise framework, the physics of emotioning. Lukens defines love strictly as committed benevolent interest, or CBI. It combines the basic emotion of interest with a committed intention aimed entirely at another person's well-being. Humans possess an innate capacity for this interest, but it requires active construction. It is an intentional practice of becoming, rather than a passive trait you simply fall into. By isolating and mapping the atomic elements of our emotions, we can actively build and maintain this capacity for CBI. Discarding the myth of mystical romance in favor of a strict physical system of emotioning provides a blueprint for resolving seemingly impossible relational conflicts. This grid acts as a periodic table of human motivation, isolating 9 basic emotions: fear, anger, sadness, disgust, guilt, shame, interest, desire, and joy. Complex feelings are mathematical combinations. Desire, fear, and anger merge into jealousy. Desire, sadness, and joy produce nostalgia. These elements form the basis of structural determinism. Emotions are an ongoing physical process, what Lukens calls emotioning, and they act as the sole engine driving all volitional human behavior. Because behavior is driven by the configuration of these emotions, the cultural concept of purely rational just thinking is an illusion. Your choices are steered by underlying emotional states. True free will does not exist as an absence of causes. Instead, we can develop autonomy, the learned capacity to map, understand, and deliberately work with our own emotional drivers. Trying to outthink a bad habit fails because willpower cannot override a structural physical system. You have to map the system itself to change the output. An emotional circuit moves sequentially from a trigger to emotion through feeling states, prompting action, and reaching completion. For example, a child loses a cookie, the trigger, firing the emotion of sadness. If the child retrieves the cookie, the sadness circuit completes, returning to baseline. If retrieval is impossible, but the child is comforted and lets the cookie go, the circuit successfully completes. But without retrieval or comfort, the emotion remains unresolved. The circuit forms an infinite glowing loop between the emotion and the blocked action. Decades later, our most mystifying self-destructive adult behaviors are secretly powered by these invisible, looping circuits running in the background of our minds. Unresolved circuits physically accumulate in what Lukens calls the fuck-it bucket, fed by 2 funnels. Guilt and shame pour into self-esteem damage. Anger and sadness pour into grief and loss. Hormones, neurochemicals, thoughts, feelings, and emotions act as vectors, compounding the internal pressure. When the accumulated pressure exceeds the bucket's physical capacity, the system overflows. The mechanical result is acting out: addiction, sudden outbursts, withdrawal, and self-sabotage. Chronic destructive behavior is never a moral failing or a character flaw. It is simply the mechanical overflow of an unmanaged, overpressurized emotional system seeking relief. This scale represents the love-contempt continuum. Contempt is the structural negation of love. When contempt surfaces, it isn't a conscious choice. It's the mechanical outcome of an overflowing bucket. Relational stress triggers fear and anger, automatically dragging our baseline into the contempt zone. Standard relationship advice tells couples to just communicate better. That approach fails because you cannot layer positive communication tactics over a system that is mechanically outputting contempt. This is the emotional positioning system, or EPS graph, a dynamic bar chart mapping the 9 basic emotions on the x-axis against their intensity on the y-axis. During a fight, this graph visualizes ambivalence. Multiple competing emotional circuits fire simultaneously, pursuing conflicting goals. Fear, desire, and anger all spike at once, creating a chaotic behavioral profile. To resolve the conflict, you must follow a prescribed order of operations. You have to use autonomy to track your open circuits and explicitly subtract contempt before you can add love. You can override structural contempt by deliberately spiking your basic emotion of interest toward the other person. Mathematically, as true interest is forced upward, the intensity of fear and anger decreases. The EPS graph strips away the confusing narrative of a relationship fight. It transforms overwhelming, messy arguments into solvable, objective structural equations. Consider a parent staying awake in the middle of the night to care for a sick child, despite feeling physically exhausted, irritated, and afraid. While the immediate feeling in that moment might be frustration or fatigue, the underlying commitment to the child's recovery constitutes the core of CBI. CBI is not a magical cure-all, nor is it unconditional love. It is the rigorous daily practice of granting validity to another person's right to exist, regardless of the emotional friction. Removing the pressure to constantly feel love allows us to build a durable physical commitment. CBI survives emotional volatility because it is anchored in action, not mood. Lukens concludes this framework with a working hypothesis, the co-emergence of love and wisdom. This is a strict scientific hypothesis with testable predictions. It relies on observable structural mechanics, not spiritual ideals or philosophical poetry. Wisdom, in this model, is not a measure of IQ or accumulated life experience. It is the structural capacity to navigate your own internal emotioning while simultaneously maintaining a benevolent interest in another person. Mastering the physics of emotioning does not turn human beings into unfeeling machines. It builds the structural foundation required to finally love each other correctly.